When Jesus was born. The traditional date for Jesus' birth is December 25th, but this is almost certainly not historically accurate. Biblical scholars and historians have long debated the actual timing of Jesus' birth, with evidence pointing to a different season altogether. The Gospel of Luke mentions shepherds watching their flocks by night when angels announced Jesus' birth, which would be unusual in the cold Judean winter months. Shepherds typically kept their flocks in the fields from spring to early fall. Another clue comes from the Roman census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. These administrative events were usually conducted in warmer months when travel was easier, not during winter when roads could be difficult or impassable. Based on astronomical calculations, the Star of Bethlehem that guided the wise men might have been a conjunction of planets or other celestial event. Some researchers have identified possible astronomical phenomena occurring in either spring or fall of various years between 7 and 2 BCE. The December date actually emerged centuries later when early Christians appropriated the popular Roman festival of Saturnalia and winter solstice celebrations. This helped Christianity spread by aligning with existing cultural practices rather than challenging them. Most biblical scholars today place Jesus' birth sometime between 6 and 4 BCE, likely in spring or autumn, though the exact month and day remain unknown. This earlier date than our calendar suggests comes from historical records indicating King Herod died in 4 BCE, and the Bible states Jesus was born during his reign. The uncertainty about Jesus' birth date reminds us that many biblical details were recorded for theological significance rather than as precise historical documentation. When the rapture will happen. The rapture is a theological concept popularized primarily among evangelical Protestant Christians, describing a future event where believers will be suddenly taken up to heaven before a period of tribulation on earth. Despite its prominence in modern Christian thought, the term rapture never actually appears in the Bible. The most commonly cited biblical passage supporting this concept comes from 1 Thessalonians, where Paul writes about the faithful being caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. This cryptic description has spawned countless interpretations and predictions throughout history. Historically, predictions about the rapture's timing have repeatedly failed. William Miller famously predicted Christ's return in 1843, leading to the Great Disappointment when nothing happened. More recently, Harold Camping made headlines by predicting the rapture would occur on May 21, 2011, even spending millions on billboards announcing the date, only to awkwardly revise his prediction when the day passed uneventfully. Biblical literalists often attempt to calculate the rapture's timing using numerical codes, astronomical alignments, or by interpreting modern events as fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The 4 blood moons theory, Israel's establishment as a nation, and various Middle Eastern conflicts have all been cited as precursors to the end times. Jesus himself addressed the question of timing directly in the Gospels, stating that, "About that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." This explicit statement hasn't deterred generations of believers from trying to crack the code anyway. Interestingly, the concept of a pre-tribulation rapture is relatively new in Christian theology, gaining popularity primarily in the 19th century through John Nelson Darby's dispensational interpretations. Before this, most Christians throughout history believed in a post-tribulation return of Christ. The rapture has become firmly embedded in American popular culture through best-selling books like the Left Behind series and countless doomsday predictions that have kept late-night talk show hosts well supplied with monologue material for decades. Theological scholars point out that focusing excessively on predicting the rapture often contradicts the Bible's emphasis on faithful living in the present. Ark of Noah location. The final resting place of Noah's Ark has been one of history's most enduring archaeological mysteries. According to the biblical account in Genesis, after the Great Flood receded, the Ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, a region in what is now eastern Turkey. Mount Ararat itself, a dormant volcanic mountain standing over 16,000 feet tall, has been the traditional focus of Ark searches since at least the 4th century. Several expeditions have claimed evidence of a large wooden structure preserved in ice near the summit, though none have produced definitive proof that archaeologists widely accept. A competing location is the nearby formation called Darupanar, discovered in 1959 after aerial photographs revealed a boat-shaped object approximately 530 feet long, suspiciously close to the biblical dimensions of the Ark. Some researchers believe geological processes formed this structure naturally, while others maintain it contains petrified wood from the original vessel. Iranian sites have also drawn attention, particularly Mount Sabalon and Mount Suleiman, where local traditions speak of the Ark's landing. These alternative locations align with some interpretations that the Ark may have landed in the mountains of Urartu, an ancient kingdom that encompassed parts of Armenia, Turkey, and Iran. Even more surprising locations have been proposed, including Ethiopia's highlands, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to house remnants of the Ark, and China's Mount Ararat North, where researchers claim to find ancient wooden structures in the 2000s. The search for Noah's Ark remains hampered by political instability in the region, extreme weather conditions, and the fact that wood exposed to the elements for thousands of years would likely have decomposed unless preserved under extraordinary circumstances. Some scholars suggest we should look for stone anchors rather than wooden remains, as these would have survived the millennia more reliably. Perhaps the most honest assessment came from a veteran Ark hunter who, after 50 years of searching, admitted, "Finding Noah's Ark is like trying to locate a specific splinter in a lumber mill that's been operating for 4,000 years. Yet the quest continues, fueled by the tantalizing possibility that physical evidence of one of humanity's oldest stories might still exist. Ark of the Covenant location. The Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered wooden chest containing the 10 Commandments, disappeared from biblical record around 586 BCE when Babylonian forces destroyed Jerusalem's first temple. Its whereabouts have remained one of history's greatest religious mysteries. One persistent theory claims the Ark resides in Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Ark was brought to their country by Menelik, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and now remains hidden in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. A single guardian monk watches over it, and no one else is permitted to see this sacred relic. Jerusalem itself offers several possibilities. Some scholars believe the Ark never left the Temple Mount, either hidden in secret tunnels beneath the temple or buried somewhere on the sacred plateau. Israeli archaeologists have long sought permission to excavate under the Dome of the Rock, but political and religious sensitivities have prevented such exploration. The copper scroll found among the Dead Sea Scrolls presents another intriguing lead. This unusual document lists 64 locations where temple treasures were supposedly hidden before the Babylonian invasion, with some researchers suggesting the Ark might be among these concealed items. More exotic theories place the Ark in locations ranging from Zimbabwe's ancient stone city of Great Zimbabwe to a secret vault beneath the Chartres Cathedral in France. Even America hasn't escaped speculation, with some fringe historians suggesting Knights Templar transported the Ark to Oak Island in Nova Scotia. In a somewhat less spiritual interpretation, some archaeologists propose the Ark was simply looted by the Babylonians along with other temple treasures. The Bible meticulously catalogs items taken from the temple, yet curiously never mentions the Ark among them, a silence that has fueled centuries of speculation. Perhaps the most unusual theory comes from rabbinical tradition, which suggests the Ark wasn't physically taken at all, but miraculously transported to heaven just before the temple's destruction. This would explain why it vanished so completely from historical record, leaving not a single credible sighting in over 2,000 years. Despite countless expeditions, remote sensing surveys, and archaeological digs, the Ark remains stubbornly hidden, assuming it still exists at all. Location of Jesus' tomb. According to the Gospels, Jesus was buried in a rock-cut tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea after his crucifixion. Today, two main sites in Jerusalem claim to be the authentic location of Jesus' burial and resurrection. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands as the traditional site, identified by Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine, around 326 CE. This massive church encloses what believers consider both Golgotha, the hill of crucifixion, and the tomb itself. Recent scientific analysis dated the limestone cave within the church to at least the 4th century CE, aligning with historical accounts of Constantine's church construction. The garden tomb, discovered in 1883, offers an alternative location just outside Jerusalem's city walls. Its supporters point to its proximity to a hill resembling a skull, matching descriptions of Golgotha, and its garden setting that aligns with biblical accounts. Archaeological evidence, however, dates this tomb to the Iron Age, centuries before Jesus' time. Less mainstream theories exist as well. Some fringe scholars suggest Jesus survived the crucifixion and was eventually buried in Kashmir, India, where a tomb called Rosabal is venerated by some as his final resting place. Local tradition claims Jesus traveled to India during his missing years and returned after supposedly surviving the crucifixion. Another controversial claim comes from the Talpiot tomb, discovered in Jerusalem in 1980. This family tomb contained ossuaries with inscriptions including Jesus, son of Joseph, Mary, and other names associated with Jesus' family. Statistical analysis of these name combinations has sparked heated debate about whether this represents the actual family tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. The Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain adds another layer to the mystery. This blood-stained cloth purportedly wrapped around Jesus' head in the tomb has blood patterns that some researchers claim match those on the Shroud of Turin. If authentic, these artifacts might provide clues about the original tomb's conditions. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Jesus' tomb isn't its location but its reported emptiness. All 4 Gospels describe the tomb being found empty days after the burial, forming the basis for belief in resurrection. This theological significance may ultimately overshadow the archaeological quest for the physical site. After 2,000 years of pilgrimage, construction, destruction, and renovation, definitively identifying the exact location of Jesus' original tomb remains challenging. As one archaeologist quipped, the tomb of Jesus might be the most sought-after empty space in history. Holy Grail location. The Holy Grail, supposedly the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, has captivated the imagination of treasure hunters and historians for centuries. Despite appearing nowhere in the Bible itself, this legendary artifact has spawned countless quests and theories about its whereabouts. Valencia Cathedral in Spain houses what many Catholic faithful consider the authentic Holy Grail. This simple agate cup dates to the 1st century BCE and has a documented history back to at least 1075 CE. Scientific analysis confirms its Middle Eastern origin, lending some credibility to the claim, though nothing definitively connects it to Jesus. Glastonbury in England offers another contender based on medieval legends that Joseph of Arimathea brought the Grail to Britain after the crucifixion. According to this tradition, he buried the cup at what is now Glastonbury Tor, where it supposedly produced the miraculous chalice well, whose waters turn surrounding stones red. The chalice of Doña Urraca in Spain presents yet another possibility. This ornate 11th century vessel combines an ancient Roman cup with medieval metalwork. In 2014, historians suggested this artifact, kept at the Basilica of San Isidoro, might be the true Grail based on documents linking it to Jerusalem. Some scholars propose the Grail isn't a cup at all, but rather a mistranslation of ancient texts. The Old French Saint Grail, Holy Grail, might have originally been sang real, meaning royal blood, potentially referring to descendants of Jesus rather than a physical object, an idea popularized by books like The Da Vinci Code. The Nanteos Cup, a simple wooden bowl preserved in Wales until 2015 when it was stolen, attracted pilgrims for centuries who believed it had healing properties. Local tradition held that this humble vessel was carved from the true cross and brought to Britain by Celtic monks. Genoa Cathedral in Italy displays what they call the Sacro Catino, a hexagonal emerald green glass vessel believed by some to be the Holy Grail. Napoleon's scientists later determined it was colored glass rather than emerald, but its ancient Middle Eastern origin keeps it in the running. After nearly 2,000 years of searching, the Grail seems determined to maintain its mystique. Perhaps the real Holy Grail was the historical wild goose chase it inspired along the way, a chase that has produced some of our most enduring literature, art, and conspiracy theories. Biblically accurate angels. The popular modern conception of angels as beautiful human-like beings with feathery wings and halos bears little resemblance to how they're actually described in the Bible. When biblical texts detail angelic encounters, they often present beings so strange and terrifying that their first words to humans are frequently "fear not." Biblical angels appear in various forms depending on their type and rank within the celestial hierarchy. The most bizarre descriptions come from prophetic visions, particularly in the books of Ezekiel and Revelation, where we encounter forms far removed from Renaissance paintings. Ezekiel describes creatures called ophanim, or wheels, as interlocking golden wheels covered with eyes. Meanwhile, seraphim are depicted as having 6 wings, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, and 2 for flying. Their entire bodies, including these wings, were reportedly filled with eyes even underneath. Perhaps most striking are the cherubim, not the chubby babies of Valentine's cards, but powerful beings with 4 faces, human, lion, ox, and eagle, and 4 wings covered with eyes. The angels who appeared to humans often took more approachable forms, though still intimidating enough to provoke terror. When angels visited Sodom, they appeared as men, and the angel that wrestled with Jacob similarly took human form. The angel at Jesus' empty tomb was described as having an appearance like lightning, and his clothing white as snow, causing the guards to become like dead men from fear. This discrepancy between biblical descriptions and our popular understanding is why internet memes about biblically accurate angels gain traction. They highlight how our cultural depictions have sanitized and humanized beings the Bible portrays as utterly alien and overwhelming. These strange descriptions served theological purposes, representing the incomprehensible otherness of the divine realm. The multiple eyes symbolized omniscience, while the various faces represented dominion over all creation. The terrifying appearance emphasized the vast gulf between human and divine reality. Even the word angel itself, from the Hebrew malach and Greek angelos, simply means messenger. Their appearance was secondary to their function as communicators between the divine and human realms, bringing messages so powerful that their bearers had to begin with, "Do not be afraid." God's true name. The name of God in the Hebrew Bible appears as 4 Hebrew letters, known as the Tetragrammaton. This name occurs over 6,000 times in the original text, but is considered so sacred in Jewish tradition that it was never pronounced aloud. Instead, when reading scripture, Jews would substitute Adonai, meaning Lord. This reverence led to a peculiar situation. The original pronunciation was eventually lost. With Hebrew originally written without vowels, and strict prohibitions against speaking the divine name, later generations could only guess at its pronunciation. The popular rendering Jehovah emerged in medieval times as scholars combined the consonant with the vowels from Adonai, creating a hybrid term most linguists now consider historically inaccurate. Many biblical scholars today believe the name was originally pronounced Yahweh, based on linguistic evidence and ancient transcriptions. In Exodus, when Moses asks God for his name at the burning bush, God responds with, "I am who I am," Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, suggesting the divine name relates to the Hebrew verb to be, or to exist. Ancient Israelites also used alternative names for God, including El, Elohim, El Shaddai, and El Elyon. Each name emphasized different divine attributes, Creator, Almighty, Most High, suggesting that early Hebrew theology recognized various aspects of divinity rather than a single name capturing God's entire essence. Some mystical Jewish traditions teach that the Tetragrammaton contains profound cosmic power. Kabbalistic texts suggest that the 4 letters correspond to the 4 worlds of creation and that their proper pronunciation could theoretically perform miracles. This belief contributed to the name's restricted use, as its power was considered too dangerous for casual utterance. Early Christianity inherited this reverence for God's name. Greek translations of the Bible substituted Kyrios, Lord, for YHWH, a practice continued in most modern translations using Lord in all capitals to indicate where the Tetragrammaton appears in Hebrew texts. The search for God's true name extends beyond Judaism and Christianity. Islamic tradition credits Allah with 99 names, each describing an attribute of the divine, while maintaining that there exists a hidden 100th name of supreme power known only to the prophets and the righteous. The debate over God's true name continues among scholars, linguists, and theologians. Meanwhile, many believers embrace the irony that the name of an omnipresent deity remains one of history's most elusive words. Lost Tribes of Israel. The Lost Tribes of Israel refer to the 10 tribes that comprise the northern kingdom of Israel, which was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 722 BCE. Following their defeat, these tribes were deported from their homeland and subsequently disappeared from historical record, creating one of the Bible's most enduring mysteries. According to the Hebrew Bible, the 12 tribes of Israel descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. After King Solomon's death, the kingdom split into two: the southern kingdom of Judah, consisting of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the northern kingdom of Israel, made up of the other 10 tribes. When Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, they implemented their imperial policy of forced resettlement, scattering the Israelites throughout their empire. While the tribes of Judah and Benjamin survived to become modern Judaism, the fate of the 10 northern tribes remains unknown. The Assyrian records confirm the conquest but provide little information about where exactly these people were relocated or what became of them afterward. Over centuries, numerous theories have emerged about their whereabouts. Some suggest they were completely assimilated into other cultures, losing their distinct identity. Others maintain they migrated to distant lands, with claims placing them everywhere from Afghanistan and China to Ethiopia, Japan, and even the Americas. One popular theory identifies them with various peoples of Central Asia and the Caucasus. The Pashtuns of Afghanistan, the Bni Manash of India, and certain Ethiopian Jewish communities have all claimed descent from the lost tribes. These claims are often supported by similarities in religious practices, customs, or shared oral traditions. Modern genetic studies have provided some intriguing but inconclusive evidence. DNA testing of groups claiming Israelite heritage has occasionally revealed genetic markers consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry, though establishing direct lineage to ancient Israelites remains challenging. Religious significance of the lost tribes extends beyond mere historical curiosity. In Jewish tradition, their return is associated with the Messianic age. Some Christian interpretations, particularly among groups like Mormons and British Israelites, incorporate the lost tribes into their theological frameworks, suggesting they migrated to specific regions important to their religious narratives. The search continues to this day, with both academic researchers and religious groups investigating various populations around the world. What makes this mystery particularly fascinating is that unlike purely mythological elements of religious texts, the Assyrian conquest and deportation of the northern kingdom is well documented in multiple historical sources. The question isn't whether these people existed, but rather what became of them after they vanished from the pages of recorded history. Site of the crucifixion. The exact location where Jesus was crucified remains one of Christianity's most debated historical questions. The Gospels identify the site as Golgotha, meaning place of the skull in Aramaic, but pinpointing this location in modern Jerusalem has proven challenging. Christian tradition has long venerated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the authentic site. Built in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine, this church was constructed after his mother Helena reportedly identified the location through divine guidance. Archaeological evidence confirms the site existed outside Jerusalem's walls during Jesus' time, aligning with biblical accounts that crucifixions occurred outside the city. A competing theory emerged in the 19th century when British General Charles Gordon identified a different location now called Gordon's Calvary. This rocky hill near Damascus Gate features indentations resembling eye sockets, giving it a skull-like appearance. Adjacent to this site is the Garden Tomb, which some Protestants believe could be Jesus' burial place instead of the Holy Sepulchre. Archaeological findings complicate both claims. The Holy Sepulchre sits on land that was definitely outside the city walls during Jesus' era, while Gordon's Calvary may have been part of an ancient stone quarry. Both locations have features consistent with first-century burial practices, including rock-cut tombs. Historical records indicate the original site was hidden under a temple to Venus built by Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, potentially to suppress Christian worship. When Constantine's workers demolished this temple, they supposedly discovered the tomb of Christ beneath it. Modern scientific techniques, including ground-penetrating radar and radiocarbon dating, have been used to examine both sites, but no definitive proof has emerged for either location. Some scholars even propose alternative sites altogether, including locations on the Mount of Olives. Interestingly, the dispute over the true crucifixion site has created an unintended benefit for pilgrims, twice the spiritual destinations for the price of one Holy Land tour package. The uncertainty surrounding Golgotha demonstrates how even major biblical events can be difficult to pinpoint geographically, as precise locations were often less important to ancient writers than the theological significance of the events themselves. Nephilim. The Nephilim are among the Bible's most mysterious figures, mentioned briefly but memorably in the book of Genesis. According to the text, they were the offspring of sons of God and daughters of men, described as heroes of old, men of renown, and giants who lived on earth before and after the Great Flood. Genesis chapter 6 specifically mentions the Nephilim appearing when divine beings mated with human women, creating these extraordinary hybrid offspring. This provocative passage has sparked endless debate about who these beings actually were and their significance in biblical history. Some traditional interpretations suggest the sons of God were fallen angels who produced these superhuman offspring with mortal women. This view was popular in ancient Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, which elaborates extensively on the Nephilim, portraying them as corrupt giants who taught humans forbidden knowledge and brought violence to the earth. Other scholars argue the sons of God were actually from the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the daughters of men from Cain's corrupt lineage, representing not literal giants, but metaphorical moral corruption. This interpretation avoids the problematic theological implications of angels breeding with humans. Adding to the mystery, Numbers chapter 13 describes Israelite spies encountering Nephilim descendants in Canaan after the flood, reporting, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, compared to these imposing figures." This passage raises questions about how Nephilim could exist after the flood was supposed to have wiped out all but Noah's family. Archaeological evidence provides a curious parallel, as many ancient cultures worldwide have legends of giants or men of renown in their distant past. Some point to occasional discoveries of unusually large human skeletal remains, though many such findings have proven to be misidentifications or hoaxes when subjected to scientific scrutiny. The Nephilim account might also reflect ancient cultural contacts with exceptionally tall peoples. Historical records show that certain ancient groups, like the Amorites, were indeed taller than average Middle Eastern populations, potentially inspiring tales of giants that grew in the telling over generations. Ultimately, the tantalizing brevity of biblical references to the Nephilim guarantees they remain one of Scripture's most enduring mysteries, just enough information to captivate the imagination, but not enough to settle the debate about who these enigmatic figures really were and what role they played in humanity's early history. Tower of Babel location. The Tower of Babel narrative found in Genesis chapter 11 describes humanity's attempt to build a tower reaching to the heavens, resulting in God confusing their languages and scattering them across the earth. While the story serves theological purposes, archaeologists and historians have long debated whether it might be based on a real structure from antiquity. Mesopotamia, particularly southern Iraq, is the most widely accepted candidate region for the tower's potential location. This area was home to the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians who constructed massive stepped pyramid temples called ziggurats. These imposing structures dotted the Mesopotamian landscape and were dedicated to various deities. The most compelling candidate is the ziggurat of Etemenenki in ancient Babylon. Historical records indicate it stood about 300 feet tall, dedicated to the god Marduk. Several clay tablets, including the Esagil tablet, provide detailed measurements of this structure. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, he was reportedly so impressed by the ruins of Etemenanke that he ordered its restoration, though he died before work could begin. Another possibility is the Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE and dedicated to the moon god Nana. While smaller than Etemenanke, it's better preserved and showcases the engineering capabilities of ancient Mesopotamians. The timing of these structures aligns reasonably well with biblical chronology. The Tower of Babel story appears in Genesis after the flood narrative and before Abraham's journey, placing it roughly in the early Bronze Age when ziggurat construction was beginning to flourish. Linguistic evidence adds another layer of intrigue. The name Babel in the Genesis account likely derives from the Akkadian phrase Babilu, meaning gate of God, which was the etymology of Babylon itself. However, the Hebrew text makes a wordplay connecting it to the Hebrew word balal, meaning to confuse, reflecting the story's focus on language diversification. Some scholars have suggested alternative locations, including sites in Turkey or even the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, but these theories have gained little traction in academic circles due to geographical and chronological inconsistencies with the biblical narrative. Recent archaeological expeditions have used satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to identify foundations of ancient ziggurats throughout Mesopotamia, though definitive identification of which, if any, might have inspired the Tower of Babel story remains elusive. Some of these massive structures continue to be maintained or rebuilt over thousands of years, complicating dating efforts. What are Leviathan and Behemoth? Leviathan and Behemoth are two mysterious creatures described in the Old Testament, particularly in the Book of Job, that have fascinated biblical scholars, theologians, and cryptozoologists for centuries. In Job chapters 40 and 41, God describes these creatures in vivid detail to demonstrate his power over creation. Behemoth is portrayed as a massive land beast with bones like tubes of bronze and limbs like bars of iron, feeding on grass while possessing tremendous strength. Some translations note that he moves his tail like a cedar, suggesting an enormous appendage. Leviathan, meanwhile, is described as a fearsome aquatic creature with impenetrable scales that laughs at the rattling of javelins and leaves a shining wake behind it in the water. The text claims nothing on earth is its equal and describes it breathing fire and smoke, with its undersides like sharp potsherds. Many modern scholars interpret these creatures as literary hyperbole describing known animals. Behemoth is often identified as a hippopotamus, which ancient Hebrews would have encountered in Egypt and along the Nile. The cedar-like tail reference, however, doesn't match a hippo's small tail, leading some to suggest the description combines features of multiple animals. Leviathan is commonly associated with a crocodile, which matches many attributes described in Job, except notably for the fire-breathing. Some scholars suggest this element was added as poetic embellishment to emphasize the creature's terrifying nature, while others point to the literary connection between Leviathan and ancient Near Eastern chaos, monsters like the Canaanite Lotan. Young Earth creationists offer a different interpretation, proposing these might be descriptions of dinosaurs or other prehistoric creatures that, in their view, coexisted with humans. They suggest Behemoth could be a sauropod dinosaur like Brachiosaurus, while Leviathan might be a marine reptile such as Kronosaurus or a surviving sea dragon. Throughout history, Leviathan gained additional symbolic significance, representing chaos, evil, or Satan himself in various theological traditions. In medieval art and literature, Leviathan was often depicted as a sea serpent or dragon, cementing its place in cultural imagination beyond its biblical origins. The Millennium. The term Millennium refers to the 1,000-year reign of Christ described in Revelation chapter 20. This apocalyptic concept has been interpreted in vastly different ways throughout Christian history, creating several competing theological frameworks. The most literal interpretation, called premillennialism, teaches that Christ will return physically to earth before the millennium begins. According to this view, Jesus will establish a tangible kingdom headquartered in Jerusalem, ruling the nations with his resurrected saints for exactly 1,000 years. This period would feature unprecedented peace, divine justice, and nature itself being partially restored to its Edenic state. Amillennialism, in contrast, interprets the millennium symbolically rather than literally. This view, popularized by Augustine and embraced by many Catholic and Reformed theologians, suggests we are currently living in the millennium, a spiritual reign of Christ through his church that began at his resurrection. The 1,000 years represents an indefinite long period between Christ's first and second comings. A third perspective, postmillennialism, teaches that Christians will gradually transform society through evangelism and social action, creating a golden age of Christian dominance lasting 1,000 years. Only after this successful global transformation would Christ physically return. This optimistic view was particularly popular during the 19th century progressive era. Beyond these three main interpretations lies a bewildering array of variations. Some premillennialists believe in a secret rapture of believers before a 7-year tribulation period. Others expect Christians to endure terrible persecution before Christ's return initiates the millennium. The theological stakes feel enormous to many believers because one's millennial position shapes how Christians understand their role in society. Should they primarily focus on spiritual conversion while waiting for divine intervention, work to transform earthly institutions, or simply see the millennium as Christ's spiritual reign already underway? Interestingly, the word millennium only appears in this single chapter of Revelation, yet it has spawned countless books, denominations, and passionate debates. As one theologian wryly noted, Christians have spilled more ink arguing about 1,000 years than the 1,000 years would take to actually pass. Why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. The biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are infamous for their catastrophic destruction, traditionally viewed as divine punishment for extreme wickedness. According to Genesis, God rained sulfur and fire upon these cities, completely obliterating them from the Jordan plain. The most common interpretation centers on sexual immorality. When angels disguised as men visited Lot in Sodom, the men of the city surrounded Lot's house demanding to know the visitors, widely understood as a euphemism for sexual assault. Lot's offer to substitute his own daughters instead highlights the cultural complexity behind this narrative. However, contrary to popular belief, sexual sin wasn't the only reason cited for their destruction. The prophet Ezekiel later described Sodom's sin as pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness, and failing to strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. This suggests a broader indictment of social injustice, callousness toward suffering, and extreme self-indulgence. Archaeological evidence may support a catastrophic end to cities in this region. Excavations at Tal el-Hammam, a site in Jordan believed by some researchers to be ancient Sodom, reveal a mysterious destruction layer dating to approximately 1700 BCE. This layer contains evidence of extreme heat, melted pottery, and unusual minerals that could indicate a cosmic airburst, perhaps a meteorite explosion over the city. The scientific theory proposes a Tunguska-like event where an asteroid or comet exploded above the ground, creating a superheated blast wave capable of obliterating cities instantly. This would explain the biblical description of fire from heaven and the rain of burning sulfur. Geological studies of the Dead Sea region show evidence of significant seismic activity throughout history. Some scholars suggest that an earthquake may have triggered fires and released natural gas deposits or bitumen, which would burn dramatically and create fire and brimstone effects. Beyond literal interpretations, the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative serves as a powerful moral warning in three major world religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all reference this destruction as evidence of divine judgment against societies that become morally corrupt. Whether historical event, moral parable, or some combination of both, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah remains one of the most vivid apocalyptic scenes in biblical literature, continuing to inspire theological debate, scientific inquiry, and cultural references thousands of years after it was first recorded. Conflicting stories of Jesus' resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ stands as Christianity's cornerstone event, yet the four gospel accounts contain notable differences that have intrigued scholars for centuries. These variations appear in details such as who discovered the empty tomb, what they saw there, and Jesus' subsequent appearances. According to Mark's account, the earliest written gospel, 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, discover the empty tomb and encounter a young man in white who tells them Jesus has risen. Interestingly, Mark's original ending concludes with the women fleeing in fear and telling no one, although later manuscripts added additional resurrection appearances. Matthew's version includes a dramatic earthquake, an angel descending from heaven to roll away the stone, and guards becoming like dead men from fear. In this account, Jesus first appears to the women as they leave the tomb, instructing them to tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee. Luke's narrative differs by describing 2 men in dazzling clothes at the tomb and a larger group of women discovering it empty. He uniquely includes the detailed road to Emmaus story, where 2 disciples fail to recognize the resurrected Jesus until he breaks bread with them. John's Gospel presents Mary Magdalene finding the tomb alone, then Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved racing to investigate. John also features the famous Doubting Thomas episode and a seaside appearance where Jesus reinstates Peter after his denials. These variations have sparked centuries of debate. Some critics point to them as evidence against the resurrection's historicity, while defenders argue the differences actually strengthen the account's authenticity, as coordinated fabrications would likely have eliminated such discrepancies. Theologians often note that ancient biographical writing prioritized thematic truth over precise chronological reporting. Each gospel writer emphasized different theological aspects of the resurrection while maintaining the core claim that Jesus' tomb was found empty and he was encountered alive by his followers. Biblical scholars have proposed various harmonizations of these accounts, suggesting the differences stem from multiple groups of witnesses, abbreviated tellings of complex events, and distinct theological emphases rather than contradictions. The earliest Christian creeds, predating even the Gospels, already contained the resurrection as a central claim of the emerging faith. For believers, these textual variations matter less than the consistent proclamation across all 4 Gospels. Death could not hold Jesus, and his resurrection launched a movement that transformed history. For historians, reconciling these accounts remains a fascinating puzzle piece in understanding Christianity's origins. Missing removed books. The Bible we know today underwent a lengthy process of selection and editing, with many texts being removed or excluded from the final canonical versions used by various Christian denominations. These missing books, sometimes called lost books or apocrypha, number in the dozens and represent a fascinating glimpse into alternative Christian traditions and theological viewpoints. The most well-known collection of excluded texts is the Deuterocanonical books, or Second Canon, which includes works like Tobit, Judith, and Maccabees. Catholic and Orthodox Bibles include these books, while Protestant Bibles removed them during the Reformation era, considering them less divinely inspired than other texts. Martin Luther famously referred to some of these works as useful but not on par with sacred scripture. Other more controversial excluded works include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. These texts often contain stories about Jesus that range from the philosophically complex to the downright bizarre, like young Jesus bringing clay birds to life or striking dead a child who bumped into him. Church authorities rejected these for contradicting established theology or for their connection to Gnostic beliefs. The Book of Enoch presents another interesting case. Quoted directly in the canonical Book of Jude, it contains elaborate descriptions of fallen angels, the origins of demons, and apocalyptic prophecies. Despite its influence on early Christianity, it was excluded from most canons, though it remains canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to this day. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is often mistakenly credited with voting on which books to include in the Bible, but the canon formation was actually a much longer organic process spanning several centuries. The council dealt primarily with the nature of Christ, rather than which books belonged in Scripture. The final lists we know today weren't firmly established until much later. Scholars continue debating whether these excluded texts contain legitimate historical information or theological insights that could enhance our understanding of early Christianity. Some argue these works were rightfully excluded for containing fanciful stories or heretical ideas, while others suggest political motivations influenced which voices were silenced in the official narrative. Modern discoveries like the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945 have unearthed copies of many previously lost texts, allowing contemporary readers to judge their content firsthand, something church authorities of previous eras might have preferred to prevent. As one early church leader quipped about a now-lost gospel, "It's better not known than misunderstood." Jesus making a whip of cords. One of the most striking moments in Jesus' ministry occurs when he drives merchants from the Jerusalem temple, a story appearing in all 4 Gospels. In John's account, there's a distinctive detail often overlooked. Jesus doesn't simply overturn tables in righteous anger, he first takes time to make a whip of cords. John 2:15 describes how Jesus made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. This deliberate preparation suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous outburst, challenging the common portrayal of this as a moment of uncontrolled rage. Biblical scholars debate the significance of this detail, which appears only in John's Gospel. Some suggest it demonstrates Jesus' calculated response to the temple's commercialization, while others see it as symbolic of divine judgment. The Greek word phrygellion used here specifically refers to a whip made of multiple cords or small ropes twisted together. The historical context matters significantly. The temple courts had become a marketplace where sacrificial animals were sold at inflated prices, with money changers converting Roman currency to temple currency at exploitative rates. This system burdened poor worshippers and turned sacred space into what Jesus called a den of robbers. Archaeological evidence confirms the extensive commercial activity in the temple's outer courts during the 1st century. Excavations have uncovered numerous money-changing stalls and animal pens precisely where the Gospels place this confrontation. Interestingly, while this story is often called the cleansing of the temple, Jesus never actually strikes any people with the whip. The text specifically mentions he drove out the animals, suggesting the whip was primarily used to herd livestock rather than assault the merchants themselves, though the implicit threat certainly added urgency to his commands. This episode represents one of Jesus' most politically charged actions, directly challenging the temple authorities and their economic systems. Some historians suggest this confrontation was a key factor leading to his arrest and crucifixion, as it threatened both religious and economic power structures of the time. The image of a whip-wielding Jesus stands in stark contrast to his usual portrayal as gentle and peaceful, offering a reminder that the historical Jesus embraced righteous indignation when confronting exploitation and corruption, even taking time to braid a few cords together before making his point. Moses' existence. Historical evidence for Moses, the towering biblical figure who led the Israelites out of Egypt, remains surprisingly elusive outside religious texts. The Bible portrays him as the adopted prince of Egypt who became a prophet, lawgiver, and liberator, yet his name appears nowhere in Egyptian records discovered thus far. This absence is noteworthy considering Egypt's meticulous documentation of significant events. No archaeological evidence directly confirms the Exodus as described in the Bible, though this doesn't necessarily disprove Moses' existence, since many historical figures leave limited physical traces. Some scholars suggest Moses may have been a composite character representing multiple historical leaders, or a legendary figure who embodied the collective memory of the Hebrew people's journey to freedom. Others point to the name Moses itself, which derives from Egyptian root words meaning son of or born of, lending credibility to his Egyptian upbringing. The Midianite connection provides another interesting angle. Biblical accounts place Moses in Midian for years, and archaeological findings confirm interactions between Egyptian-educated individuals and Midianite groups during the relevant time period. This cultural exchange might explain how Egyptian religious concepts could have influenced early Hebrew beliefs. The historical time frame for Moses' life remains debated. Some place him during the reign of Rameses II, 13th century BCE, while others argue for an earlier period during Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Without direct evidence, these timelines remain speculative. Interestingly, ancient non-biblical sources do reference Moses. The Greek historian Hecataeus of Abdera mentioned him around 300 BCE, and other classical writers like Manetho discussed a leader matching Moses' description, though often with negative characterizations reflecting Egyptian perspectives. Whether purely historical, partly legendary, or a combination of both, Moses' cultural impact remains undeniable. The Torah, traditionally attributed to him, established foundations for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, ultimately shaping billions of lives regardless of his literal existence. Jesus' missing years. The Bible contains remarkably little information about Jesus' life between his early childhood and the beginning of his ministry around age 30. This approximately 18-year gap has become known as the lost years, or missing years of Jesus, spawning countless theories about what occurred during this significant portion of his life. In the Gospel accounts, we see Jesus as a 12-year-old impressing religious teachers in the Jerusalem temple. The next time he appears in the narrative, he is approximately 30 years old and beginning his public ministry with his baptism by John the Baptist. This enormous chronological jump leaves nearly 2 decades unaccounted for in the biblical record. Several traditions attempt to fill this gap. One popular theory suggests Jesus traveled to India, where he studied with Hindu and Buddhist masters. Proponents point to similarities between some of Jesus' teachings and Eastern philosophy. The controversial text, Life of Saint Isa, claims to document Jesus' time in India, though most scholars consider it a 19th century fabrication. Another tradition places Jesus in Britain, speculating he accompanied his uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who some legends identify as a tin merchant who traveled to the British Isles. This theory became particularly popular in medieval England and connects to later Arthurian legends. Some scholars propose a more mundane explanation, that Jesus simply remained in Nazareth working as a carpenter alongside his father Joseph, learning the family trade and living an ordinary life before his ministry began. The Gospels refer to Jesus as the carpenter's son and the carpenter, suggesting he indeed practiced this profession. The silence in the Gospels about these years might actually be intentional. The Gospel writers were not creating comprehensive biographies, but focused accounts aimed at conveying theological messages about Jesus' identity and mission. If nothing spiritually significant happened during those years, they may have seen no reason to include them. Interestingly, this gap created space for numerous apocryphal stories to emerge, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which portrays the young Jesus performing miracles, some benevolent and others troublingly vindictive. These texts were rejected by church authorities and not included in the canonical Bible. Whatever Jesus did during these missing years, they represent the longest period of his life about which we know virtually nothing. A tantalizing mystery at the heart of Christianity's foundational story, and a reminder that even the most influential figures in history can have chapters of their lives completely lost to time. The authors. The Bible contains 66 books written over a span of roughly 1,600 years, yet many people are surprised to learn we don't actually know who wrote much of it. While tradition assigns authorship to various figures, modern scholarship paints a more complex picture. The first 5 books, called the Torah or Pentateuch, were traditionally attributed to Moses. However, textual analysis reveals multiple distinct writing styles, contradictory accounts, and references to events after Moses' death. Many scholars now believe these texts evolved through multiple authors and editors over centuries, a theory known as the documentary hypothesis. The Gospels present another authorship mystery. None of the 4 canonical Gospels actually identify their authors within the text itself. The traditional attributions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came later. Most biblical scholars believe these texts were written between 40 and 100 years after Jesus' death, possibly by followers of the apostles rather than eyewitnesses themselves. The Pauline epistles include 13 letters attributed to Paul, but scholarly consensus holds that some were likely written by his followers. Letters like Ephesians and the pastoral epistles show vocabulary and theological concerns different from Paul's undisputed works, suggesting later composition by others using his authority. Some biblical books openly acknowledge editorial processes. Proverbs states it contains sayings collected by King Solomon, but also includes sections attributed to others like Agur and King Lemuel. The Psalms credit various authors including David, Asaph, and the sons of Korah. The identity of certain biblical authors remains particularly enigmatic. The Book of Hebrews, despite its theological importance, never names its author. Early Christians debated whether Paul wrote it, but differences in style and theology make this unlikely. As Origen famously remarked in the 3rd century, "Who wrote the epistle in truth, God knows." Perhaps the most mysterious biblical author is the writer of Revelation, who identifies himself only as John. While traditionally associated with the Apostle John, many scholars believe it was written by a different John entirely, possibly a Jewish Christian prophet exiled to Patmos during Domitian's reign. This authorship uncertainty doesn't necessarily diminish the Bible's significance, but reminds us that many biblical texts emerged from complex communal processes rather than single authors. Like ancient stonemasons who built cathedrals without signing their work, many biblical writers seem content to let their contributions stand without claiming personal credit. The Q source. The Q source represents one of biblical scholarship's most significant theoretical documents, a hypothetical lost text believed to have influenced both Matthew and Luke's Gospels. Biblical scholars proposed this theory after noticing striking similarities between Matthew and Luke that don't appear in Mark, suggesting they shared an additional common source. The name Q comes from the German word Quell, meaning source. Scholars estimate this document would have contained primarily sayings and teachings of Jesus, with minimal narrative elements. Think of it as an ancient collection of Jesus' greatest hits, all wisdom, no miracles. Textual analysis reveals about 230 verses shared between Matthew and Luke, but absent from Mark. These double tradition passages often appear in nearly identical wording, strengthening the case that both authors were referencing the same document rather than drawing from oral traditions. Interestingly, Q appears focused on ethical teachings rather than theological concepts like salvation or the resurrection. This suggests it may have been compiled by a community more interested in Jesus as a wisdom teacher than as a divine figure. Imagine a spiritual self-help book rather than a religious manifesto. Critics of the Q hypothesis argue that Luke might have simply borrowed directly from Matthew, eliminating the need for a separate source document. However, this doesn't easily explain why Luke would rearrange Matthew's material so dramatically or omit important Matthean passages. If Q existed, it would have been written in Greek around the 50s or 60s CE, making it potentially one of our earliest windows into Jesus' teachings. Despite extensive searches, no physical copy of Q has ever been discovered, leading some to question whether it existed at all. The Q source theory demonstrates how biblical scholars use literary detective work to reconstruct the complex development of New Testament texts. Melchizedek's origins. Melchizedek appears briefly yet mysteriously in the book of Genesis as both king of Salem and priest of God Most High. This enigmatic figure blesses Abraham after a military victory and receives a tithe from him, yet the Bible provides almost no background information on who he actually was. Unlike nearly every other significant biblical figure, Melchizedek has no genealogy recorded. The book of Hebrews specifically highlights this unusual omission, describing him as without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. This deliberate absence of origin story has spawned numerous theories throughout religious history. Some Jewish traditions identify Melchizedek as Shem, Noah's son who supposedly outlived Abraham according to biblical chronology. This would explain his priestly authority and connection to monotheistic worship predating the Levitical priesthood. Early Christian writers sometimes viewed Melchizedek as a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, a theophany similar to the mysterious angel of the Lord who appears elsewhere in the Old Testament. This interpretation stems from Hebrews comparing Jesus to Melchizedek as a priest in the order of Melchizedek rather than from the line of Aaron. Alternative theories propose Melchizedek was an angel in human form, specifically the archangel Michael. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of a Melchizedek document that portrays him as a heavenly figure who will preside over the final judgment, suggesting some Jewish sects viewed him as more than human. More historically grounded explanations suggest Melchizedek was simply a local Canaanite king-priest who worshipped El Elyon, a deity whose attributes were similar enough to Abraham's God that the biblical author recognized their common worship. Salem, his kingdom, is widely believed to be in early Jerusalem. The name Melchizedek itself provides intriguing clues, translating roughly to King of Righteousness, while his title King of Salem means King of Peace, symbolic names that may indicate his story served primarily as theological symbolism rather than strict history. Whatever his true origins, Melchizedek's importance to biblical theology far outweighs his brief appearance. He established a priestly precedent outside the Levitical system that later became crucial for explaining Jesus' role as the ultimate high priest, despite not being from the tribe of Levi. Abraham's existence. Abraham is a foundational figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but verifying his historical existence remains challenging for scholars and archaeologists. Traditional biblical chronology places Abraham around 2000 to 1800 BCE, though these dates are difficult to confirm through archaeological evidence. The biblical account describes Abraham's journey from Ur in Mesopotamia to Canaan, establishing covenants with God and fathering Isaac in his old age. While these narratives form the cornerstone of multiple religious traditions, they first appear in texts written centuries after the events they describe. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with Abraham, such as Ur and Hebron, have uncovered evidence of ancient settlements, but nothing that definitively confirms his personal existence. Some scholars suggest the patriarchal narratives reflect collective cultural memories rather than precise historical biographies. Interesting parallels exist between Abraham's story and other ancient Near Eastern texts. The Nutsi tablets from northern Mesopotamia describe legal customs similar to those in Genesis, such as childless couples using servants as surrogates for childbearing, lending cultural context to Abraham's era. The absence of direct archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily disprove Abraham's existence. Many ancient figures leave minimal material traces, especially nomadic or semi-nomadic leaders whose lifestyle wouldn't generate substantial archaeological remains. Abraham's family unit would have been relatively small, making physical evidence of their specific presence extremely difficult to find thousands of years later. Some scholars propose Abraham represents a composite figure embodying tribal origins and religious developments of ancient Hebrew peoples. Others maintain he was a genuine historical person whose story was preserved through oral tradition before being recorded in written form. The discovery of the Ebla tablets in Syria during the 1970s initially created excitement when researchers claimed they mentioned names like Abraham and Sodom, but subsequent analysis disputed these translations, showing the perpetual challenges of connecting biblical narratives to archaeological findings. One thing historians do agree on is that the world of early 2nd millennium BCE Mesopotamia and Canaan broadly matches the cultural backdrop described in Abraham's story, with its city-states, tribal movements, and religious diversity. David and Solomon's existence. The biblical figures of King David and King Solomon are central to Jewish and Christian traditions, described as powerful monarchs who established Israel as a significant kingdom during the 10th century BCE. However, archaeological evidence for these iconic rulers has been surprisingly limited, leading to ongoing debates about their historical reality. Archaeological surveys in Jerusalem have uncovered city walls and other structures dating to roughly the correct time period, but nothing definitively linked to a grand, united monarchy, as described in the Bible. The limited monumental architecture found from this era suggests a more modest political entity than the powerful kingdom portrayed in Scripture. In 1993, archaeologists discovered a stone inscription at Tel Dan mentioning the House of David, providing the first non-biblical evidence of David's dynasty. This finding, while not confirming David as depicted in the Bible, does suggest a historical ruler named David established a lineage of some importance in the region. For Solomon, the evidence is even more elusive. The Bible describes him commissioning massive building projects, maintaining a grand palace, and amassing enormous wealth. Yet archaeological excavations reveal little matching this description from his purported reign. Some ruins once attributed to Solomon, such as gates at Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, have been redated to different periods. Scholars remain divided on how to interpret this limited evidence. Minimalists argue that David and Solomon were likely minor local chieftains whose stories were greatly exaggerated by later biblical authors for theological and political purposes. Maximalists counter that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, suggesting that Jerusalem's continuous habitation has obscured or destroyed much of the archaeological record. Recent excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa, a fortified city from the appropriate era, have reignited the debate. Some archaeologists believe the sophisticated urban planning there supports the existence of a centralized authority consistent with David's kingdom, while others remain unconvinced. The consensus among moderate scholars today acknowledges that figures named David and Solomon likely existed as rulers in ancient Israel, but their kingdom was probably smaller and less magnificent than portrayed in biblical accounts. This view sees the Bible as containing a historical core embellished over centuries of oral tradition and religious development. Goliath's true height. The biblical story of David and Goliath describes the Philistine warrior as a fearsome giant, but his actual height has become a subject of scholarly debate. Different ancient manuscripts provide conflicting measurements, leading to centuries of speculation about just how tall this legendary figure really was. In the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew version of the Old Testament, Goliath is described as standing 6 cubits and a span tall. Using ancient measurements, this would convert to approximately 9 feet, 9 inches, truly a giant by any standard. This is the measurement most commonly cited in popular retellings of the story. However, in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Goliath's height is listed as 4 cubits and a span, which would make him roughly 6 feet, 9 inches tall. While still impressively tall for the ancient world, this measurement depicts a much more realistic human height. The discrepancy might have emerged from scribal errors during centuries of manuscript copying, or perhaps from deliberate theological embellishment to enhance the miracle of David's victory. Ancient storytelling often employed hyperbole to emphasize important points, in this case the overwhelming odds faced by the young shepherd boy. Archaeological evidence suggests the average male height in that region and era was around 5 feet 3 inches. Even at the more conservative measurement of 6 feet 9 inches, Goliath would have towered over typical Israelite soldiers, making him an intimidating opponent without needing to be of supernatural stature. Some scholars have proposed that Goliath may have suffered from a medical condition like gigantism caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland. This could explain his unusual height and possibly other characteristics mentioned in the text, such as his need for an armor-bearer to guide him, which might indicate poor vision, a common symptom of the condition. The debate over Goliath's height ultimately reminds us that biblical narratives often combine historical events with theological storytelling. The point of the David and Goliath story isn't primarily about the precise height of the Philistine warrior, but rather about how faith and courage can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, even if those obstacles were closer to 7 feet than 10. Did Genesis plagiarize the Epic of Gilgamesh? The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian poem dating back to around 2100 BCE, contains striking parallels to biblical narratives that appeared centuries later, particularly the flood story in Genesis. These similarities have led many scholars to question whether biblical writers borrowed from earlier myths. The Gilgamesh flood account features a righteous man named Utnapishtim, who is instructed by a god to build a large boat to survive a worldwide flood sent to destroy humanity. He brings his family and animals aboard. The flood devastates the earth, the boat lands on a mountain, and birds are sent out to find dry land. These elements mirror Noah's story in remarkable detail. Beyond the flood narrative, other parallels exist. Both texts feature a paradise-like garden, a devious serpent, and a plant associated with immortality or knowledge. The Gilgamesh epic even includes a character who lives an exceptionally long life, similar to the long-lived patriarchs in Genesis. These similarities don't necessarily mean direct copying occurred. Many scholars suggest both accounts may derive from shared cultural memories of catastrophic flooding in the ancient Near East. Geological evidence confirms massive floods in Mesopotamia's history that could have inspired regional flood legends. The dating of these texts complicates matters. The earliest fragments of Gilgamesh predate the written composition of Genesis by nearly 1,000 years. However, the oral traditions behind Genesis may be much older than its written form, which took shape during the Babylonian exile when Hebrews had direct contact with Mesopotamian literature. Religious perspectives on these parallels vary widely. Some view the similarities as evidence that Genesis adapted existing stories to communicate theological truths rather than literal history. Others argue that multiple cultures preserved memories of actual events, with Genesis containing the most accurate account. The academic consensus points to cultural diffusion rather than plagiarism in the modern sense. Ancient writers didn't share our concepts of copyright or originality. They freely adapted existing narratives to convey their own cultural and religious messages. The biblical authors likely transformed older flood stories to emphasize their monotheistic worldview and unique understanding of divine justice and mercy. Interestingly, the differences between these accounts may be more revealing than their similarities. While Gilgamesh depicts quarreling gods who fear humans might become too powerful, Genesis presents one sovereign God who judges humanity on moral grounds while preserving creation through a covenant relationship. Camel discrepancies. The Bible contains several surprising inconsistencies regarding camels that create a notable historical puzzle for scholars and archaeologists. According to the text, patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob owned camels in the book of Genesis, with numerous mentions of these animals throughout early biblical narratives set around 2000 to 1500 BCE. However, archaeological evidence suggests domesticated camels weren't widely present in the ancient Near East until much later, approximately the 10th century BCE. Excavations at ancient sites like Tel Jaffa and Tel Timna revealed camel bones only in layers dating after 1000 BCE, with a clear increase in camel remains appearing precisely when the Bible suggests the animals should have been common. This discrepancy has led some scholars to suggest these camel references represent anachronisms, details added by later writers who projected animals familiar in their own time back into earlier stories. It's similar to how a modern author might accidentally include a telephone in a story set in the 1700s. Other researchers propose alternative explanations. Some suggest limited camel domestication might have occurred earlier, but left minimal archaeological traces. Others point to evidence of domesticated camels in neighboring regions like Egypt and Mesopotamia from earlier periods, indicating possible trade connections that brought occasional camels into Canaan. The humble camel controversy illustrates the fascinating intersection between biblical text and archaeological science. While seemingly minor, these dromedary discrepancies highlight the complex nature of ancient texts that were compiled, edited, and transmitted across centuries. Some faithful readers see these inconsistencies as evidence the biblical authors weren't creating fictional accounts, but working with genuine traditions, occasionally updating details to make ancient stories more relatable to later audiences. Jewish enslavement in Egypt. The biblical account of Hebrew enslavement in Egypt forms a cornerstone of the Jewish origin story, yet archaeological evidence for this narrative remains conspicuously absent. According to the Book of Exodus, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years, with a significant portion spent in bondage before Moses led them to freedom. Despite extensive archaeological work in Egypt, no direct physical evidence has been found confirming the presence of a large Israelite slave population. Egyptian records, which meticulously documented various aspects of their civilization, contain no clear references to Hebrew slaves or the dramatic exodus described in biblical texts. Some scholars suggest the biblical narrative may represent a smaller-scale historical event that grew in significance through oral tradition. Perhaps a smaller group of Semitic people experienced oppression in Egypt, with their story eventually expanding to encompass the entire Israelite identity. Interestingly, archaeological evidence does confirm that Semitic peoples moved between Canaan and Egypt throughout the 2nd millennium BCE. The Hyksos, a Semitic people who ruled northern Egypt for about a century, were eventually expelled, potentially providing a historical kernel for the Exodus story. The lack of physical evidence doesn't necessarily invalidate the biblical account entirely. Ancient slave populations typically leave minimal archaeological footprints, and the eastern Nile Delta, where the Israelites supposedly lived, has high groundwater levels that deteriorate physical remains. The name Ramesses mentioned in Exodus corresponds to a real Egyptian city, Pi-Ramesses, which flourished during the 13th century BCE. This has led many scholars to place any potential exodus during this period, though this timeline creates other historical complications. The absence of evidence has led some to view the entire narrative as theological rather than historical, a powerful founding myth intended to establish Israelite identity and their covenant relationship with God. Lilith and Kipas. Lilith appears in ancient Jewish folklore as Adam's first wife, created equally from the earth rather than from Adam's rib. According to these traditions, she refused to be subservient to Adam and left the Garden of Eden, later becoming associated with demons and child mortality in medieval Jewish texts. Lilith's name appears once in the Bible, in Isaiah 34:14, where most modern translations render her as night creature or night monster, though older translations like the King James Version use screech owl. Some scholars believe this represents an ancient Mesopotamian female demon who was absorbed into Jewish tradition. The development of Lilith's character expanded significantly in the medieval period with the alphabet of Ben Sira, which elaborated on her rebellion against Adam and subsequent demonic transformation. Later, Kabbalistic texts further enhanced her mythology, portraying her as the consort of Samael and mother of demons. Kipas is less well known, but appears in the same passage of Isaiah alongside Lilith. In Isaiah 34:15, Kipas is typically translated as an arrow snake, or desert owl, depending on the translation. The Hebrew word may refer to a type of darting serpent or bird. Some ancient interpretations connect Kipas with demonic or unclean creatures that would inhabit ruins and desolate places after divine judgment. The context of Isaiah 34 describes the aftermath of God's judgment on Edom, where wild creatures would take over abandoned human habitations. Unlike Lilith, Kipas didn't develop an extensive mythology in later Jewish tradition, remaining a somewhat obscure biblical creature. Some scholars suggest it might have represented actual wildlife known to ancient Israelites, while others believe it reflected mythological beings from surrounding cultures. Together, Lilith and Kipas represent the mysterious, darker elements within biblical literature that were often interpreted through the lens of ancient Near Eastern demonology. Their brief mentions opened the door for centuries of speculation and folklore that far exceeded their original biblical appearances. Goliath is killed twice. In the biblical narrative, a curious contradiction appears regarding the death of the Philistine giant Goliath. Most people know the famous story of young David slaying Goliath with a sling and stone as told in 1 Samuel 17. This iconic underdog tale has permeated culture for centuries, symbolizing triumph over seemingly impossible odds. However, a puzzling passage appears in 2 Samuel 21:19, which states that Elhanan son of Yare-Oregim killed Goliath the Gittite. This creates an apparent contradiction. How could Goliath be killed twice by 2 different people? Biblical scholars have proposed several solutions to this textual mystery. One explanation suggests a scribal error occurred in copying the manuscripts. The parallel account in 1 Chronicles 25 clarifies that Elhanan actually killed Lami, the brother of Goliath, not Goliath himself. Another theory posits that Goliath might have been a hereditary title or family name for Philistine champions rather than just one individual. This would mean David and Elhanan killed different warriors who both carried the title Goliath. Some scholars propose that ancient storytelling traditions may have attributed the same heroic deed to different figures as the oral traditions developed over time before being written down. This phenomenon, known as duplicate attribution, appears in other ancient literature as well. The King James Version attempts to resolve the contradiction by adding words not in the original Hebrew text, making 2 Samuel 21:19 read that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. Most modern translations acknowledge this addition with italics or footnotes. Copper Scroll Treasures. The Copper Scroll is one of the most enigmatic artifacts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unlike the other scrolls written on parchment or papyrus, this text was etched onto thin sheets of copper, suggesting its contents were considered extraordinarily valuable and meant to endure. Discovered in 1956 in Cave 3 near Qumran, the Copper Scroll contains what appears to be a detailed treasure map listing 64 locations where vast quantities of gold, silver, and religious artifacts were supposedly hidden. The treasure described is staggering, estimated at several dozen tons of precious metals worth billions in today's currency. The language of the scroll is unusual, written in a form of Hebrew different from other Dead Sea Scrolls, with terminology related to weights and measures that puzzled scholars for decades. Many locations mentioned are cryptic, referring to landmarks like the House of Tribute or in the cistern of the Wall of Kolit. Unlike the primarily religious content of other Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll is essentially an inventory list. Each entry follows a pattern: location, what's hidden, and sometimes the depth. One entry reads, "In the cave that is next to the fountain belonging to the house of Hakaz, dig 3 cubits. There are 2 jugs filled with silver." Archaeologists and treasure hunters have attempted to follow these directions since the scroll's discovery, but no substantial treasure has ever been found. This has led to several theories about the scroll's origin and purpose. Some scholars believe the treasure was the temple treasury from Jerusalem, hidden before the Roman destruction in 70 CE. Others suggest it was the wealth of the Essene community at Qumran, while skeptics maintain it may be purely fictional or ritualistic in nature. The use of copper itself presents a mystery. Creating this scroll required considerable metallurgical skill, as the text was hammered into the metal before it was rolled. When discovered, it was so oxidized and brittle that it had to be carefully cut into sections for preservation, a delicate operation performed at Manchester University. The scroll's technical specifications don't make for riveting treasure hunt narratives. It includes mundane details like 42 talents under the stairs in the salt pit. Not exactly the stuff of Indiana Jones, but historians find these specific measurements compelling evidence that real wealth might have been documented. If real, the Copper Scroll treasure remains one of the greatest undiscovered hoards in history. The scroll's creator went to extraordinary lengths to document these locations, suggesting they genuinely believed future generations would need this information to recover something of immense value, whether material or symbolic. The hunt continues to this day, with various expeditions still attempting to decode the scroll's cryptic directions, hoping that ancient wealth might still be waiting beneath the sands of the Judean desert, assuming it hasn't been found already by silent discoverers who preferred to keep their fortune secret. The existence of Eden. The Garden of Eden stands as one of the most enduring and mysterious locations mentioned in the Bible, described in Genesis as the paradise where humanity began. According to Scripture, it was a lush garden where the first humans, Adam and Eve, lived in harmony with nature and walked with God before their fateful decision to eat the forbidden fruit. Genesis provides some geographical markers for Eden, placing it near the intersection of 4 rivers, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. While the latter 2 are well-known rivers in Mesopotamia, the locations of the Pishon and Gihon remain enigmatic. This has led many scholars to theorize that Eden was situated somewhere in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, possibly in modern-day Iraq, Turkey, or Iran. Archaeological evidence for Eden's existence is notably absent, with no definitive physical site identified by scientists. Some researchers have suggested potential locations like the Persian Gulf Basin, which was above water during the last ice age and could have supported a lush ecosystem before flooding around 8000 BCE. Others point to the convergence of ancient rivers near the head of the Persian Gulf, or areas in eastern Turkey where headwaters of several significant rivers originate. In recent decades, underwater explorations in the Persian Gulf and Black Sea regions have revealed ancient settlements that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Some speculate these could relate to cultural memories that influenced the Eden narrative, as catastrophic flooding events might have been preserved in oral traditions that eventually became part of biblical accounts. Geological studies have shown that the Middle East was indeed more fertile in the past, with evidence of ancient lakes and green corridors in what are now deserts. Climate shifts around 10,000 years ago transformed many lush regions into the arid landscapes we see today, lending some credence to tales of a lost paradise. Some scholars approach Eden not as a literal geographical location, but as a theological concept representing humanity's original state of innocence and direct relationship with God. In this view, the detailed geography in Genesis serves as a literary device grounding a spiritual truth in concrete imagery that would resonate with ancient audiences. Interestingly, many world cultures have similar myths about a primordial paradise that was lost, from the Greek Golden Age to various indigenous traditions, suggesting either a universal human psychological archetype or perhaps distant cultural memories of a time when climate conditions were more favorable to human flourishing. The meaning of Salah. The word Salah appears 71 times in the Bible, primarily in the Book of Psalms, yet despite its frequent usage, biblical scholars have never reached a consensus on its precise meaning. This mysterious Hebrew term has puzzled translators and theologians for centuries. The most common interpretation suggests this term served as a musical notation, indicating a pause or rest in the musical performance of psalms. This theory makes sense considering the Psalms were essentially ancient Hebrew songs, and this expression often appears at the conclusion of verses or musical thoughts. In this context, it might have functioned similarly to a modern musical rest or fermata. Other scholars propose this ancient notation was an instruction for singers to lift their voices or for musicians to play louder at specific moments. The Hebrew root salal means to lift up, potentially supporting this explanation. Imagine ancient temple musicians seeing this notation and knowing it was time for a dramatic crescendo. Some interpretations suggest a more spiritual meaning, viewing this mysterious term as an invitation for worshippers to pause and reflect on the preceding words. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of saying, "Let that sink in," after making a profound point. This would explain why it frequently follows particularly meaningful or powerful verses. The Septuagint, an ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, renders this word as diapsalma, suggesting a musical interlude. Meanwhile, the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes substituted it with the word always, hinting at an emphasis on eternal truths. Intriguingly, no one bothered to preserve the exact meaning of this notation, as the tradition of temple worship changed over time. It's one of those classic, you had to be there situations from ancient history. By the time anyone thought to write down what this ancient term meant, the oral tradition explaining it had apparently been lost. Modern Bible translations handle this mystery in different ways. Some leave the original term untranslated, others place it in footnotes, and some omit it entirely. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical text that purports to describe the childhood of Jesus Christ, filling the significant gap in the Bible between Jesus' birth and his appearance in the temple at age 12. Written in the 2nd century CE, it belongs to a category of writings known as the New Testament Apocrypha, texts not included in the official biblical canon. Unlike the restrained narratives found in Matthew and Luke, this text portrays the young Jesus as wielding divine powers in sometimes troubling ways. In one notorious episode, a child who accidentally bumps into Jesus is immediately struck dead. When neighbors complain, those who criticize the boy Jesus are struck blind. The text also shows Jesus bringing clay birds to life, withering a teacher who attempts to discipline him, and resurrecting a playmate who died in an accident. The theological implications of these stories are problematic, presenting a vengeful child deity who hasn't yet learned to control his powers or developed moral restraint. This stands in stark contrast to the compassionate adult Jesus portrayed in canonical Gospels. Imagine having a playground tantrum but with divine powers, not exactly the gentle Jesus meek and mild of Sunday school lessons. Most biblical scholars believe these tales emerged from early Christian communities attempting to satisfy curiosity about Jesus' childhood years rather than preserving authentic traditions. The text shows influences from Greek and Egyptian miracle stories common in that era, suggesting cultural borrowing rather than historical memory. Despite being rejected by church authorities, the infancy gospel influenced medieval Christian art and literature. Many artistic depictions of the young Jesus bringing clay birds to life come directly from this text rather than the Bible itself, a remarkable case of apocryphal stories shaping mainstream Christian imagination. While virtually no modern scholars consider this text historically reliable, it remains valuable as evidence of how early Christians processed questions about Jesus' development and the theological challenges of reconciling his full humanity with his divinity. The dramatic contrast between this impulsive child Jesus and the measured teacher of the canonical Gospels highlights why church authorities ultimately excluded such problematic narratives from Scripture. Genesis chapter 38. Genesis chapter 38 stands as one of the Bible's most unexpected narrative detours, interrupting the famous Joseph story to follow his brother Judah into a complex tale involving sex, deception, and surprising moral conclusions. The chapter begins when Judah leaves his brothers and marries a Canaanite woman, having 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Judah arranges for to marry a woman named Tamar, but is wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God puts him to death. Following the custom of levirate marriage, Judah instructs his second son Onan to marry Tamar and provide offspring for his dead brother. Onan, however, practices an early form of contraception by spilling his seed on the ground during intercourse with Tamar, knowing any child would legally be considered his brother's heir rather than his own. God is displeased with this act and takes Onan's life as well. Scholars debate whether his punishment was for the sexual act itself or for selfishly refusing his familial duty to provide his brother's widow with children. Judah, now fearful of losing his third son, delays giving Shelah to Tamar as promised. Years pass, and Tamar realizes Judah has no intention of fulfilling his obligation. Taking matters into her own hands, she disguises herself as a prostitute and positions herself where Judah will pass by after sheep-shearing festivities. Not recognizing his daughter-in-law beneath her veil, Judah propositions her, offering a young goat as payment. As collateral until the goat can be delivered, Tamar cleverly requests Judah's personal seal, cord, and staff, items that would definitively identify him later. When Judah sends a friend to deliver the goat and retrieve his personal items, the prostitute is nowhere to be found. 3 months later, Tamar is visibly pregnant, and Judah, unaware of his own involvement, condemns her to death for immorality. In the dramatic climax, Tamar produces Judah's personal items, revealing him as the father and exposing his hypocrisy. Instead of doubling down, Judah makes a remarkable admission: "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." Tamar gives birth to twins Perez and Zerah, with Perez becoming an ancestor in the lineage of King David and eventually Jesus Christ. This chapter remains controversial for several reasons. It candidly depicts sexual content including prostitution, contraception, and incest-adjacent relationships, though technically legal at the time. It interrupts the Joseph narrative for seemingly no reason. Most troublingly for some readers, it portrays a woman using sexual deception who is ultimately vindicated rather than condemned. Theologians suggest this unusual chapter serves multiple purposes. It establishes the lineage of David and Jesus through Judah's line, demonstrates God working through flawed humans and morally ambiguous situations, and shows character development in Judah, who later offers himself as a substitute when Benjamin is threatened, perhaps having learned from his earlier failings toward Tamar. The Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas is a controversial ancient text that dramatically reframes the traditional narrative of Christianity's most notorious traitor. Discovered in the 1970s near El Minya, Egypt, the manuscript remained in obscurity until National Geographic Society acquired and published it in 2006, igniting public fascination and scholarly debate. Unlike the canonical Gospels found in the Bible, this text portrays Judas Iscariot not as a villain, but as Jesus' most trusted disciple. According to this account, Jesus secretly asked Judas to betray him as part of a divine plan to free his spiritual self from his physical body. Rather than an act of treachery, the document presents the betrayal as a sacred duty performed at Jesus' explicit request. Written in Coptic, the document is believed to be a translation of an earlier Greek text dating from approximately 180 CE, over a century after the canonical Gospels were written. The text belongs to a collection of writings associated with Gnosticism, an early Christian movement that emphasized secret knowledge and viewed the material world as corrupt and evil. The authenticity of the physical manuscript has been verified through carbon dating and ink analysis, confirming it as a genuine ancient document. However, this only proves the antiquity of the manuscript itself, not the historical accuracy of its contents. Most mainstream biblical scholars view it as a later invention reflecting Gnostic theological perspectives rather than preserving authentic teachings of Jesus. The discovered manuscript was in extremely poor condition, with pages crumbling and text missing. Scholars had to painstakingly reassemble over 1,000 fragments, and approximately 10 to 20% of the text remains lost, leaving gaps in our understanding of its complete message. National Geographic's high-profile coverage introduced this obscure text to millions worldwide, complete with a documentary, articles, and books. This mainstream attention transformed what would have otherwise remained an academic curiosity into a cultural phenomenon, sparking public reconsideration of Judas's traditional villainous role. Despite its fame, the Gospel of Judas provides little new historical information about Jesus or first-century Christianity. Its value lies primarily in illuminating the diversity of early Christian thought and the theological conflicts that shaped the religion's development in its first few centuries. The text had actually been mentioned by early church father Irenaeus around 180 CE, who condemned it as heretical. Its rediscovery confirmed what historians had long suspected, that early Christianity was far more diverse in its beliefs and sacred texts than commonly understood today. Ofir location. The mysterious land of Ofir is mentioned throughout the Bible as a place of fabulous wealth, particularly known for its gold. King Solomon's legendary wealth was partially attributed to his fleet of ships that returned from Ofir laden with gold, precious stones, exotic wood, and even peacocks and apes. While biblical texts clearly establish Ofir as a real destination for ancient trade, its actual geographical location remains one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. The Bible provides tantalizingly vague clues, describing it as accessible by sea from Ezion Geber, a port on the Red Sea, with voyages taking approximately 3 years to complete. Numerous locations have been proposed as the biblical Ofir throughout history. Some scholars argue for an Arabian location, pointing to ancient gold mines in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Others look to the Horn of Africa, particularly modern Somalia and Ethiopia, where ancient gold trade was well established. India has its proponents too, which would explain the exotic goods like peacocks that returned with the gold. More ambitious theories place Ofir in Southeast Asia, or even as far as Peru or Zimbabwe, where the ancient ruins of Great Zimbabwe have sometimes been linked to Ofir's wealth. Archaeological evidence for these various claims remains inconclusive. The most tantalizing find was a pottery shard discovered at Tel Qasil in Israel, dating to the 8th century BCE, which bears an inscription mentioning gold of Ofir, confirming the location was known to ancient Israelites but offering no clues to its whereabouts. Modern archaeological techniques, including satellite imagery and chemical analysis of gold artifacts, continue to be employed in the search. Some researchers have attempted to trace the fingerprint of gold from various regions to match against ancient Israelite artifacts, though with limited success. Whether Ofir was a specific location or perhaps a general term for distant trading posts remains debated. The name itself might have become synonymous with exotic wealth rather than a precise geographical designation, similar to how El Dorado later captivated European imaginations. The 3-year round trip mentioned in biblical accounts suggests impressive maritime capabilities for the ancient world, regardless of Ofir's exact location. This extended time frame likely included not just sailing, but extended stays for trading, mining, and waiting for favorable seasonal winds. Esther is a comedy. The book of Esther stands out in the Bible for an unusual characteristic. It's likely an ancient comedy or satire. While modern readers typically approach biblical texts with reverence, recognizing Esther's comedic elements provides crucial insight into its original intent and reception. The story's plot revolves around exaggerated, almost farcical scenarios: a king who banishes his queen for not appearing at a party, a villain who builds comically tall gallows, and a sudden reversal where the persecutor becomes the persecuted. These dramatic reversals of fortune are classic comedic structures. Character portrayals in Esther further support its comedic nature. King Ahasuerus is depicted as an incompetent ruler easily manipulated by advisors, making important decisions while drunk, and governing his empire through impulsive decrees. Haman is an over-the-top villain whose enormous ego leads to his downfall in satisfyingly ironic ways. Unlike most biblical books, Esther never mentions God directly. This absence might be intentional humor. Divine intervention occurs through coincidences and perfect timing rather than overt miracles, creating dramatic irony where the audience recognizes God's hidden hand while characters remain oblivious. The text contains numerous linguistic puns and wordplay in its original Hebrew that don't translate well to other languages. These verbal jokes would have been immediately recognized by ancient Hebrew audiences, enhancing the comedic experience. The story culminates in the festival of Purim, which historically has been celebrated with carnival-like festivities, costume parties, performances, and general merrymaking. This joyful commemoration reflects the text's underlying humorous tone. Literary scholars note that Esther employs classic satirical techniques to critique power structures, gender roles, and ethnic prejudice. Through humor, it subtly undermines the Persian Empire's authority while elevating Jewish identity and resilience. Understanding Esther as comedy doesn't diminish its theological significance. Rather, it highlights how ancient religious texts employed diverse literary styles to communicate important truths, in this case, using humor to explore themes of providence, courage, and the survival of God's people against overwhelming odds. Manora of the Second Temple. The Manora of the Second Temple stands as one of Judaism's most sacred artifacts, a magnificent 7-branched golden lampstand that illuminated the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. According to historical accounts, this menorah was crafted after the Jewish people returned from Babylonian exile around 530 BCE, replacing Solomon's original menorah that had been looted during the destruction of the First Temple. The Second Temple menorah gained particular fame after its fate was immortalized on the Arch of Titus in Rome, which depicts Roman soldiers carrying it away following the temple's destruction in 70 CE. This relief serves as the primary visual reference for the menorah's appearance, showing a hexagonal base decorated with mythical creatures, something that puzzles scholars given Jewish prohibitions against graven images. Archaeological evidence for the menorah remains frustratingly scarce. No physical remnants have been definitively identified, despite persistent legends claiming it lies hidden in the Vatican's secret archives or buried beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount. These theories gained traction during the Middle Ages, but lack substantiating evidence. The menorah's dimensions were supposedly divinely ordained, standing approximately 5.5 feet tall and crafted from a single piece of pure gold weighing around 75 pounds. This would make it extraordinarily valuable even by today's standards, explaining why it was a prime target for plunder. After the Romans captured Jerusalem, historical records suggest the menorah was displayed in the Temple of Peace in Rome until the Vandal sacking in 455 CE. Some accounts claim it was then taken to Carthage before being returned to Constantinople when Byzantine general Belisarius defeated the Vandals in 534 CE. Emperor Justinian reportedly then sent it back to Jerusalem, but the Persian conquest of the city in 614 CE marks the last credible historical mention. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue to the menorah's fate comes from a 12th century account by Benjamin of Tudela, who claimed the temple treasures were hidden in Rome. His description of their secret location beneath a building near the Tiber River has inspired treasure hunters for centuries, though repeated searches have yielded nothing. The mystery of the missing menorah continues to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the faithful alike. Some even suggest it wasn't lost at all but intentionally hidden away, waiting to be revealed when the third temple is constructed. Until then, this golden artifact remains one of history's most magnificent missing treasures, its whereabouts as elusive as the divine light it once held. Nimrod's identity. Nimrod appears in the Bible as a mighty hunter and the founder of several ancient cities, but his true identity remains shrouded in mystery. The book of Genesis introduces him briefly as a mighty hunter before the Lord and the builder of the first post-flood empire, yet provides surprisingly few details about this seemingly important figure. Biblical scholars have long debated which historical king, if any, corresponds to Nimrod. Some identify him with the Mesopotamian ruler Sargon of Akkad, who built the world's first known empire around 2300 BCE. Others connect him to Nimrod's described territory in Shinar, suggesting he might be Nimrod en Merkar, a Sumerian king of Uruk mentioned in ancient king lists. The confusion deepens with linguistic analysis. The name Nimrod may derive from the Hebrew verb marad, meaning to rebel, suggesting his character was viewed as someone who rebelled against God. This interpretation gained popularity in later Jewish and Christian traditions, where Nimrod became associated with the construction of the Tower of Babel. Ancient legends outside the Bible elaborate on Nimrod's story considerably. In various Middle Eastern traditions, he's portrayed as a giant, a tyrant who forced people to worship fire, and even as the king who tried to execute Abraham by throwing him into a fiery furnace. These traditions paint him as the archetypal enemy of God's chosen people. The historical record offers tantalizing possibilities. Archaeological discoveries confirm the existence of many cities mentioned in Nimrod's realm, including Babel, Babylon, Erech, Uruk, and Nineveh. However, attributing these cities' foundation to a single ruler remains problematic, as most developed over centuries through multiple dynasties. Some scholars take a more symbolic approach, viewing Nimrod less as a historical individual and more as a composite character representing Mesopotamian kingship or imperial power that opposed God's people. This would explain why he appears in Genesis as a representative figure of human pride and ambition. Compounding the mystery, ancient artwork from Mesopotamia depicts kings as mighty hunters, suggesting this might have been a royal title or propaganda claim rather than a description of a specific historical person's hunting prowess. Kings would hunt lions to demonstrate their strength and fitness to rule. The sparse biblical account combined with abundant later traditions has made Nimrod a blank canvas upon which different cultures have projected their own villains. He's variously been identified with the Babylonian god Marduk, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta, and even extraterrestrial visitors, depending on who's doing the identifying. The Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. The famous Tower of Babel described in Genesis chapter 11 may have been based on actual ziggurats that dominated the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. Ziggurats were massive stepped pyramid structures built by Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians as religious temples, with each level smaller than the one below it. Archaeological discoveries reveal that ziggurats were among the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient Near East. The largest known ziggurat was dedicated to Marduk in Babylon and may have inspired the biblical account. Standing over 300 feet tall, these ancient skyscrapers would have indeed seemed like attempts to reach heaven, matching the biblical narrative. Genesis tells us the tower builders used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar, which perfectly describes Mesopotamian construction techniques. The region lacked natural stone, so builders created mud bricks and used bitumen, naturally occurring tar, as mortar, exactly as archaeological evidence confirms. The biblical story places the tower in a plain in Shinar, which scholars identify as southern Mesopotamia, where numerous ziggurat ruins have been discovered. The most famous, Itamananki, was dedicated to Marduk in Babylon and has been specifically linked to the Tower of Babel account by many researchers. Intriguingly, the name Babel itself connects to this theory. In Akkadian, Babilu meant gate of God and referred to Babylon, while the Hebrew word Balal means to confuse. This wordplay in the biblical account cleverly ties the historical ziggurat to the story's theological message about language confusion. The Bible's description of people wanting to make a name for ourselves also aligns with what we know about ziggurat construction. These massive buildings were statements of civic pride and religious devotion that enhanced a city's reputation and power, exactly the kind of hubris the biblical narrative critiques. While the biblical story adds supernatural elements like divine intervention and language confusion, the core architectural description matches what archaeologists have uncovered about these ancient stepped towers. The Tower of Babel account can be read as a theological interpretation of an actual type of structure that would have been familiar to people in the ancient Near East. The United Kingdom of Israel. The United Kingdom of Israel refers to the period when ancient Israel was allegedly unified under the consecutive reigns of kings Saul, David, and Solomon, before splitting into the northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah. Despite its prominent place in biblical narrative, archaeological evidence for this united monarchy has been surprisingly elusive. According to biblical chronology, this United Kingdom existed roughly between 1050 BCE and 930 BCE. The Bible portrays this era as Israel's golden age, particularly during Solomon's reign, depicting a powerful centralized state with impressive building projects, international trade networks, and military might. Archaeological findings, however, tell a more complicated story. Until recently, little physical evidence supported the biblical account of a powerful Davidic dynasty. Jerusalem, supposedly David's capital, shows limited archaeological signs of being more than a small hill town during the 10th century BCE. The grand architectural projects attributed to Solomon, including the First Temple, have left virtually no archaeological footprint. Some scholars suggest the biblical narrative of the United Kingdom may be an exaggerated retelling created centuries later during the Babylonian exile, serving to inspire national unity during a time of crisis. According to this view, David may have been a local chieftain rather than a king of a vast territory, and Solomon's legendary wealth and wisdom might represent idealized royal propaganda. The debate shifted somewhat with discoveries like the Tel Dan Stela, an Aramaic inscription from approximately 850 BCE that contains the phrase House of David, providing the first non-biblical reference to David or his dynasty. This finding supports the historical existence of David, though not necessarily the extent of his kingdom as described biblically. Recent excavations at sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa have uncovered fortified cities dating to the early 10th century BCE, potentially supporting the existence of a centralized authority in Judah during the supposed Davidic era. However, these findings remain hotly debated among archaeologists. The archaeological record becomes clearer for the period after the supposed split of the kingdom, with distinct material cultures emerging in the northern and southern regions by the 9th century BCE. This lends some indirect support to the biblical account of a previous unity that fractured. The United Kingdom remains one of the Bible's most tantalizing historical puzzles, a foundational narrative of Israelite identity with limited archaeological confirmation. The debate reflects broader tensions between maximalist scholars who generally accept biblical accounts as historically reliable and minimalist scholars who approach biblical texts with greater skepticism absent corroborating evidence. Philistines were part of the Sea Peoples. The Philistines, biblical adversaries of the ancient Israelites, have long been associated with a mysterious coalition known as the Sea Peoples who terrorized the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Archaeological and historical evidence increasingly supports this connection, offering fascinating insights into these notorious biblical villains. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III depict a massive invasion by seafaring warriors called Peliset, a name strikingly similar to Philistine. Inscriptions at the Temple of Medinet Habu show these Peliset among the sea peoples who attacked Egypt, wearing distinctive feathered headdresses and using specific weapons and ships. Excavations at major Philistine cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gath reveal a dramatic cultural shift around this period. Suddenly, Aegean-style pottery, architecture, and burial practices appear in these coastal regions, suggesting newcomers from somewhere in the Greek world or Western Anatolia had arrived. DNA evidence recovered from Philistine burial sites in Ashkelon in 2019 provided the strongest evidence yet. Genetic analysis showed that the early Philistines carried European genetic markers not previously present in Canaan, supporting the theory of migration from the Aegean region. The Bible itself offers clues about the Philistines' foreign origins. In Amos 9 verse 7, God states he brought the Philistines from Caphtor, which many scholars identify as Crete or Cyprus. This aligns with archaeological findings suggesting an Aegean origin. The Philistines' military technology, including their famous monopoly on ironworking mentioned in 1 Samuel 13, matches what we know about the Sea People's advanced weaponry. Their five-city confederation along the southern coast of Canaan, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, created a strategic foothold typical of the Sea People's invasion pattern. Interestingly, the Philistines quickly adopted local Canaanite customs and language while maintaining some distinctive cultural traits. This pattern of adaptation matches what we know about other Sea Peoples groups who settled in new territories after the Bronze Age collapse. The biblical stories of Samson, David, and Goliath take on new dimensions when we understand the Philistines as part of this larger historical migration. They weren't just generic enemies, but representatives of a massive cultural and political upheaval that reshaped the ancient world. While scholars continue to debate specific details, the consensus view now strongly supports that the biblical Philistines were indeed part of the larger Sea Peoples phenomenon, with their arrival in Canaan representing one episode in a complex series of migrations and invasions that altered the course of ancient Mediterranean history. Relation between Matthew 27:34 and Psalm 69:21. One of the most striking connections between Old and New Testament texts is found in the parallel between Psalm 69:21 and Matthew 27:34, which many scholars consider a prophetic fulfillment occurring during the crucifixion of Jesus. In Psalm 69:21, written centuries before the crucifixion, David writes, "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." This psalm, attributed to King David, expresses deep anguish and persecution, foreshadowing suffering that would later be associated with the Messiah. Fast forward to Matthew 27:34, which records, "They offered him wine to drink, mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it." This occurred during Jesus' crucifixion, seemingly fulfilling the ancient prophecy with remarkable specificity. Some translations refer to this mixture as sour wine mixed with bitter herbs, or vinegar mixed with gall. Historically, offering a narcotic drink to those being crucified was sometimes done as a minimal mercy to dull the excruciating pain. The Roman soldiers likely offered Jesus a standard mixture of sour wine, pasca, mixed with myrrh or other bitter substances. This was common practice during Roman executions. The significance lies not just in the parallel language, but in Jesus' refusal to drink. By declining the numbing agent, many theologians believe Jesus chose to experience the full suffering of crucifixion with complete awareness, fulfilling his sacrificial purpose without diminishment. Some skeptics argue this is simply a case of the gospel writers deliberately crafting their narrative to match Old Testament prophecies, essentially working backward to create apparent fulfillments. Others counter that the number and specificity of such connections across Scripture are too numerous to be coincidental. What makes this connection particularly interesting is that it's one of dozens of detailed prophetic parallels between messianic psalms and the gospel accounts. Biblical scholars count between 25 and 30 explicit prophetic fulfillments during the crucifixion alone. The mathematical probability of one person fulfilling even 8 specific prophecies has been calculated at 1 in 10 to the 17th power, a number so large it defies comprehension. Yet Christians believe Jesus fulfilled hundreds of specific prophecies, including this seemingly minor detail about what he would drink during his execution. Jesus' anger in early versions of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, widely considered the earliest written gospel, contains several passages where Jesus displays anger or strong emotion. But what many don't know is that early manuscript evidence suggests these emotional moments were even more pronounced in original versions. In our current Bible translations, Jesus occasionally shows indignation, like when he clears the temple of money changers. However, textual analysis of the oldest Greek manuscripts reveals that later scribes may have softened Jesus' emotional responses in several key passages. One notable example occurs in Mark 1:41, where most modern translations describe Jesus as moved with compassion before healing a leper. However, some of the earliest and most reliable manuscripts actually use the Greek word orgistheus, meaning becoming angry, instead of splachnistheus, meaning feeling compassion. This suggests Jesus approached this healing with indignation rather than pity. Similarly, in Mark 3:5, Jesus looks around with anger at those watching to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. This anger remained in our current text, but textual evidence suggests it was once part of a pattern of emotional responses that characterized Mark's portrayal of Jesus. Many scholars believe these angry moments were deliberately toned down by later scribes who were uncomfortable with a Messiah who displayed such human emotions, especially negative ones. Their theological understanding of Jesus as perfectly serene and gentle conflicted with Mark's more raw, emotional portrayal. This textual history gives us a fascinating glimpse into the evolution of early Christianity. The original Mark appears to have presented a more emotionally complex Jesus who experienced frustration, anger, and indignation, particularly toward religious hypocrisy and unbelief. The angry Jesus passages suggest Mark's original audience may have understood divine authority as compatible with strong emotion, while later Christian communities increasingly emphasize Jesus' gentleness and patience. This sanitization process shows how theological concerns gradually shaped the text we read today. Understanding these textual variants doesn't necessarily undermine the gospel message, but rather enriches our understanding of how the biblical texts developed and how early Christians wrestled with portraying Jesus' full humanity alongside his divinity. Exclusion of Matthew 16:2 and 3 in some versions. Matthew 16 contains Jesus' rebuke to the Pharisees and Sadducees about discerning the signs of the times. This passage, where Jesus compares their ability to forecast weather by observing the sky with their inability to recognize the spiritual significance of his ministry, is mysteriously absent from several ancient manuscripts and some modern Bible translations. The questionable verses read, "When evening comes, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red,' and in the morning, 'Today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." This textual variant has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. The passage is missing from some of the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, including Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, as well as several early Syriac, Coptic, and Armenian translations. Modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament typically mark these verses as doubtful, and translations like the Revised Standard Version place them in brackets or footnotes to indicate their uncertain status. Some translations, such as the New American Standard Bible, include them but with notes explaining their disputed nature. Scholars suggest several theories for this textual curiosity. Some believe the verses were accidentally dropped during copying due to similar endings of nearby sentences, a common scribal error called homoioteluton. Others argue they may have been added later, perhaps borrowed from a similar passage in Luke 12:54-56 to harmonize the Gospels. The content itself isn't particularly controversial theologically, which makes the omission even more perplexing. If someone wanted to add material to the Gospel, they'd likely choose something more doctrinally significant than weather forecasting. What adds to the intrigue is that the passage fits well with Jesus' teaching style, using everyday observations to make spiritual points. This has led some scholars to argue for its authenticity despite its absence in key manuscripts. The mystery of Matthew 16:2-3 serves as a small but fascinating example of the complexities in biblical textual criticism. It's a humble reminder that the Bible we read today is the product of thousands of ancient hands copying and preserving texts across centuries, sometimes with small variations that scholars still debate 2,000 years later. Serpent seed theory. The serpent seed theory represents one of the more controversial and obscure theological interpretations found on the fringes of biblical study. This theory proposes that Eve's consumption of the forbidden fruit was actually a metaphor for sexual relations between Eve and the serpent, identified as Satan, resulting in the birth of Cain as a literal half-human, half-demonic offspring. Proponents of this theory point to Genesis 3:15, where God tells the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." They interpret seed literally as genetic descendants, rather than metaphorically as spiritual lineage. They also cite 1 John 3:12, which states that Cain belonged to the evil one, and Jesus' words in John 8:44 telling certain opponents they were of their father the devil. This interpretation gained traction in some extreme religious circles in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly among identity-based religious movements. William Branham, a controversial healing evangelist from the mid-20th century, was among its most prominent advocates, teaching that humanity descends from two separate bloodlines, one from Adam through Seth, and another corrupted line from the serpent through Cain. Mainstream biblical scholars overwhelmingly reject this theory, noting that Genesis explicitly states Adam was Cain's father in Genesis 4. They argue that the Hebrew text leaves no ambiguity on this point. Additionally, the serpent in Genesis is described as an animal, not explicitly identified as Satan until much later theological development. Critics also point out that this theory has unfortunately been used to justify racist ideologies by certain groups who claim some human populations descend from the serpent bloodline. This adaptation of the theory has been thoroughly discredited by both religious authorities and genetic science, which confirms all humans share common ancestry. Jesus, son of Pantera. The theory of Jesus, son of Pantera originates from ancient non-Christian sources, particularly in Talmudic literature, where Jesus is occasionally referred to as Yeshu ben Pantera or Yeshu ben Pandira. This obscure reference appears in several rabbinical texts dating from the 2nd century CE onward. According to this account, Jesus was allegedly the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier named Pantera or Panthera and a Jewish woman named Mary. The name Pantera may have been common among Roman soldiers during that period, particularly those of Sidonian origin who were stationed in Judea around the time of Jesus' birth. The earliest known mention of this claim comes from the philosopher Celsus in his work The True Word, written around 177 CE. Though the original text is lost, the Christian theologian Origen quotes and refutes Celsus's assertion in his work Contra Celsum. Celsus claimed he heard the story from Jewish sources who contested the virgin birth narrative. Some scholars suggest the name Pantera might actually be a play on the Greek word parthenos, meaning virgin, essentially mocking the Christian belief in the virgin birth. Others propose it could be derived from the Greek pantheros, meaning panther, possibly a nickname for the soldier. The historical reliability of these references is highly debated. Most mainstream scholars view them as polemical rather than historical, emerging during a period of significant tension between Jewish and early Christian communities. These references likely reflect theological disputes rather than preserved historical information. Modern archaeological findings have added an interesting twist to the discussion. In 1859, a Roman tombstone was discovered in Germany for a soldier named Tiberius Julius Abdes Pantera, who was from Sidon and served in Judea before being stationed in Germany. While the tombstone dates to the appropriate time period, there is no evidence connecting this particular Pantera to the Talmudic references. This obscure reference has occasionally resurfaced throughout history, particularly in skeptical or anti-Christian literature, but remains largely unknown outside academic and theological circles. It represents one of many competing narratives about Jesus' origins that circulated in the ancient world as different religious traditions contested each other's claims. Did John the Apostle live forever? A persistent mystery in Christianity concerns the fate of John, the beloved disciple of Jesus. This enigma stems from a cryptic conversation recorded in the Gospel of John chapter 21, where Jesus hints at the possibility that John might not die. After Jesus predicted Peter's martyrdom, Peter pointed to John and asked, "What about him?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This ambiguous statement quickly spread among early Christians, creating the rumor that John would never die. The author of the Gospel of John actually addresses this misunderstanding, clarifying that Jesus did not explicitly say John would never die. Yet despite this clarification, legends about John's immortality persisted throughout early Christianity and continue even today. Historical records suggest John lived to an extremely old age, dying peacefully in Ephesus around 95 CE, unusual longevity for that era. He appears to have been the only apostle to escape martyrdom, further feeding speculation about his special status. Some traditions claim John never actually died, but was assumed into heaven like Enoch or Elijah. Others suggest he merely sleeps in his tomb, his breath causing dust to stir above his grave. A medieval legend told of John being buried alive, but emerging from the grave unharmed. The Orthodox Church maintains a unique position, referring to John's death as a repose or falling asleep, rather than explicitly calling it death. Some interpretations suggest this indicates a special transition rather than ordinary death. While mainstream scholarship holds that John did eventually die, this curious statement from Jesus remains one of the Bible's more intriguing loose ends, leaving just enough ambiguity to fuel centuries of speculation about the fate of the beloved disciple. Different endings of Mark. The Gospel of Mark has a peculiar textual issue that has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries. It appears to have multiple endings. The earliest manuscripts of Mark end rather abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women fleeing from Jesus' empty tomb, trembling and bewildered, and telling no one what they had seen. However, in most modern Bibles, the Gospel continues for another 12 verses, describing Jesus' resurrection appearances and his commission to the disciples. This longer ending includes promises that believers will speak in tongues, handle snakes, and drink poison without harm, elements not found elsewhere in the Gospels. Biblical scholars generally agree that these additional verses were not part of Mark's original text, but were added later by scribes who felt the abrupt ending was unsatisfactory. The writing style and vocabulary differ noticeably from the rest of Mark, and several early church fathers make no mention of these passages when discussing the Gospel. Some ancient manuscripts contain yet another alternative ending, a shorter conclusion of just 2 sentences that briefly mentions the women reporting what they had seen, and a few rare manuscripts include an insertion between verses 14 and 15 known as the Phreologion, a dialogue between Jesus and the disciples about Satan's power. This textual puzzle raises interesting questions about early Christian attitudes toward Scripture. The scribes who added these endings weren't necessarily being deceptive. They likely believed they were completing or clarifying an unfinished work. Ancient concepts of authorship and textual authority were quite different from our modern notions. The different endings of Mark also highlight the complex process by which the Bible was transmitted and compiled. Before the invention of printing, copies were made by hand, allowing for variations to emerge and persist across different regions and traditions. Most modern Bible translations acknowledge this textual issue by including the longer ending, but setting it apart with brackets or notes explaining its disputed origin. This transparency allows readers to understand both the content and the scholarly consensus about its authenticity. Jesus in the Talmud and Old Testament. The Talmud, a central text of rabbinic Judaism containing Jewish laws and traditions, includes several controversial references to a figure who may be Jesus of Nazareth. These passages appear under names like Yeshu, Ben Stada, or Ben Pandera, and typically portray this individual in a negative light. Talmudic references describe this figure as being born illegitimately, practicing sorcery in Egypt, leading Israel astray, and being executed. Scholars debate whether these actually refer to Jesus or possibly other individuals from the same era. The ambiguity stems from chronological inconsistencies and the lack of explicit identification. During medieval times, these passages became focal points of religious disputes. Christian authorities often censored the Talmud, removing sections they considered blasphemous against Jesus. In some regions, entire Talmudic volumes were burned under accusations of anti-Christian sentiment. Regarding Jesus in the Old Testament, Christians have traditionally identified numerous prophetic references they believe foretell Jesus' coming. Isaiah 7:14 mentions a virgin birth, while Isaiah 53 describes a suffering servant who bears others' iniquities. Psalm 22 depicts details reminiscent of crucifixion, and Micah 5:2 names Bethlehem as the birthplace of a future ruler. Jewish scholars generally interpret these passages differently, viewing them as referring to Israel collectively, historical figures of their time, or future events unrelated to Jesus. The Isaiah virgin prophecy, for instance, uses the Hebrew word alma, which can mean young woman rather than specifically virgin. The Messianic prophecies create one of the fundamental interpretive divides between Jewish and Christian biblical scholarship. Christians see Jesus as the fulfillment of these prophecies, while Jewish tradition maintains that the expected Messiah has not yet come. Some scholars suggest the Gospel writers may have crafted narratives to deliberately align with Old Testament prophecies, what theologians call prophecy historicized, rather than history prophesied. This remains one of the most debated aspects of biblical interpretation. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls written before Jesus' time contain interpretations of messianic prophecies that share similarities with Christian readings, suggesting some of these interpretations weren't entirely novel inventions of early Christians, but had precedent in certain Jewish sects. Meaning of the ages given in Genesis. The extraordinary lifespans recorded in Genesis have puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. The text claims Adam lived 930 years, while Methuselah, the oldest person mentioned, reached 969 years before the flood came. These extreme ages have generated multiple interpretations. Some biblical literalists argue these numbers should be taken at face value, suggesting antediluvian humans genuinely lived nearly a millennium due to different environmental conditions before the flood, minimal genetic mutations, or direct divine blessing. Other scholars propose these numbers held symbolic rather than literal significance. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, numbers often carried specific meanings beyond their mathematical value. The recurring patterns of numbers ending in 0 or 9 throughout Genesis' patriarchal ages hint at deliberate numerical symbolism rather than precise record-keeping. One compelling theory suggests a mistranslation occurred between number systems. Ancient Sumerian texts used a sexagesimal system, base 60, while Hebrew used a decimal system, base 10. This conversion could have accidentally inflated ages when texts were translated between cultures. Mesopotamian king lists similarly record rulers reigning for hundreds or thousands of years, suggesting the Genesis ages might reflect a cultural literary convention rather than literal history. These exaggerated lifespans may have served to establish the importance and authority of founding figures. Some researchers point to an interesting pattern where post-flood lifespans gradually decrease, perhaps documenting a belief that humanity was slowly declining from an original state of perfection. This mirrors creation myths from other cultures where earlier ages were considered superior to the present. Linguists have suggested the Hebrew word Shana, translated as year, might have originally meant a different time period, perhaps lunar cycles or seasons rather than complete solar years, which would yield more reasonable lifespans when recalculated. While many modern readers find these ages scientifically implausible, ancient audiences likely understood these numbers within their cultural and literary context. The precise meaning intended by the original authors remains one of the Bible's enduring mysteries. The original Bible. What we now call the Bible didn't originally exist as a single book. The Bible as we know it today evolved over centuries through a complex process of writing, editing, selection, and translation that spans more than a millennium. The earliest biblical texts were written on scrolls made from papyrus or animal skins in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. These individual scrolls contained separate books or portions of what would later become the biblical canon. Nothing resembling a complete Bible existed until several centuries after the events they described. For the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the earliest complete manuscript we possess is the Leningrad Codex from around 1009 CE. Prior to this, the Dead Sea Scrolls, dating from roughly 200 BCE to 100 CE, contain fragments of every Old Testament book except Esther. The New Testament writings emerged between 50 and 100 CE, but the earliest complete New Testament manuscript, Codex Sinaiticus, dates to the 4th century. Before this, we have only fragments and partial collections of texts. The process of determining which texts were considered divinely inspired and authoritative, called canonization, took centuries. The Jewish canon was largely settled by the 2nd century CE. The Christian canon remained somewhat fluid until the 4th century, with some regional variations continuing even longer. Translation adds another layer of complexity. The first major translation was the Septuagint, a Greek version of Hebrew scriptures created around 250 BCE. Later came Jerome's Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, which became the standard Bible in Western Europe for over 1,000 years. Each translation involves interpretive choices. The famous King James Version, completed in 1611, was actually the work of 47 scholars who debated word choices and consulted earlier translations as well as available manuscripts. So when someone asks about the original Bible, they're asking about something that never quite existed in the form we might imagine. What we have instead is a textual tradition, a river of manuscripts, translations, and editorial decisions flowing through history, continually shaped by human hands while attempting to preserve divine words. Moses was an atonist priest. The theory that Moses was actually an Egyptian priest of Aton, rather than a Hebrew by birth, has gained attention among some historical researchers and religious scholars. This controversial hypothesis connects Moses to the short-lived monotheistic religion established by Pharaoh Akhenaten in ancient Egypt. Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt around 1350 BCE, radically transformed Egyptian religion by elevating the sun disk Aten to supreme deity status while suppressing worship of traditional gods. The similarities between Atonism and early Hebrew monotheism have led some scholars to suggest a direct connection. Proponents of this theory point to Moses' Egyptian upbringing in Pharaoh's court as described in Exodus. They argue his name is actually Egyptian rather than Hebrew in origin, possibly derived from common Egyptian names like Thutmose or Ramose, which included the Egyptian root mos, meaning born of or child of. The timeline offers another potential connection. After Akhenaten's death, there was a violent counter-revolution against Atonism, forcing its priests to flee Egypt. This period roughly coincides with the estimated time of the Exodus narrative, suggesting Moses might have been an Atonist priest escaping religious persecution. Some scholars note conceptual parallels between Akhenaten's Great Hymn to the Aton and Psalm 104 in the Bible, pointing to potential theological influences. Both texts praise a singular universal deity responsible for all creation in remarkably similar language. Critics of this theory emphasize that despite surface similarities, fundamental differences exist between Atonism and early Judaism. Atonism remained focused on the physical sun disk, while Judaism developed a concept of a non-physical universal God. Additionally, traditional dating places Moses several centuries after Akhenaten's reign, though these chronologies remain debated. Mainstream biblical scholarship generally rejects this hypothesis due to limited archaeological evidence directly connecting Moses to Atonism. Similarities between the Great Hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104. The Great Hymn to the Aten, composed during the reign of Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BCE, bears striking resemblances to the biblical Psalm 104, written centuries later. These parallels have fascinated scholars and prompted debates about possible historical connections between ancient Egyptian religious texts and Hebrew scripture. Akhenaten's revolutionary monotheistic worship of the sun disk, Aten, represented a dramatic departure from traditional Egyptian polytheism. His hymn praises the Aten as the creator and sustainer of all life, using imagery and concepts remarkably similar to those found in Psalm 104, which celebrates Yahweh's creation and providence. Both texts describe their deity causing darkness when they withdraw, bringing light when they appear, and controlling the rhythm of day and night. They share imagery of ships sailing on waters created by the deity, animals receiving their food from divine provision, and plants flourishing under divine care. The structural flow of themes follows a surprisingly similar pattern in both compositions. Several specific phrases appear nearly identical, such as describing how all creatures depend on the deity for sustenance and how they become troubled when the deity hides their face. Both texts emphasize how humans and animals go about their work during daylight and rest at night according to divine design. Scholars debate whether these similarities indicate direct influence, common cultural heritage, or independent development of universal religious concepts. Some suggest Moses, traditionally considered the author of many psalms, may have been educated in Egyptian literature during his upbringing in Pharaoh's court, potentially encountering Akhenaten's compositions. Others point out that the hymn was rediscovered only in modern times, raising questions about how Hebrew writers could have accessed it. The hymn was inscribed in private tombs of Akhenaten's officials at Amarna, not widely distributed texts, though oral transmission remains possible. The most striking difference between the texts involves their theological framework. The hymn to the Aten identifies the physical sun disk itself as the deity, while Psalm 104 portrays Yahweh as transcendent, using the sun and nature as mere tools of divine expression rather than being divine themselves. This textual connection represents one of the most intriguing possible links between ancient Egyptian religion during its brief monotheistic period and early Hebrew theology, potentially shedding light on the complex cross-cultural influences that shaped ancient religious thought throughout the Near East.